Japan's ownership of an entire archipelago in the East China Sea may be up for review, not by Tokyo, but by Beijing. The Okinawa Island chain is home to sprawling U.S. military bases and tens of thousands of American troops. The People's Daily, considered a mouthpiece of China's Communist Party, all but laid claim to the archipelago in an article written by academics. Japan quickly hit back, denouncing the paper as a political tool and declaring its ownership of Okinawa beyond doubt. It's the latest territorial dispute marring relations between the two Asian powers. Both are also locked into contest over another island chain. Right, let's get more perspective on what China is hoping to achieve here with James Corbett, editor of a Japan news website. Mr. Corbett, a bold move on China's part, but realistically, what does Beijing hope to gain here?
Well, I think we have to keep this in perspective in terms of a political, in terms of actual political movement from this type of statement. I don't think much is going to happen. Basically, as you point out, this is a study that's been released by some academics, and it has been published on the People's Daily. But I don't think we can say it's necessarily coming from the Beijing government, or that we would expect anything to come of this from the on the international level. But it is, at the very least, an interesting new development in the territorial dispute, and obviously meant to at least increase pressure on Japan over the disputed Senkaku Islands, which is another part of this territorial dispute that's going on. But in terms of Okinawa itself, it's been within the Japanese sphere of influence for at least the last 400 years now, and has been formally ceded by China in the Treaty of Shimonoseki back in 1895. So I think it's well embedded by now in international politics that it is part of Japanese territory.
We've seen kind of this ping-pong thing happening between Japan and China. How long will Japanese patience last? It's been frequently prodded by China these last few years, and with regards to territorial disputes.
Well, I don't think that's something that's really up to Japan to decide, because I think that China is basically just asserting itself internationally in more different areas, not only within its own backyard. For example, we saw the Bank of China recently cutting off the Foreign National Bank of North Korea, but we see it venturing into other types of diplomatic forays that we haven't seen before, with both Abbas and Netanyahu visiting China this week, and Beijing and Xi Jinping coming out and saying that there is a Chinese idea for an Israeli-Palestinian peace plan. So China really does seem to be starting to flex its international muscles a little bit more right now, and I think we have to see that within that broader development. And Japan, I think, is going to be more or less a spectator in this. I don't think that they have the ability to really stop China from making these types of claims. It's just a question of if and when this would to actually spill into military confrontation.
What of the U.S. bases stationed there? Is there something to worry about in terms of that?
Well, I think that's what basically solidifies this as being Japanese territory, is that U.S. military presence there, which means that barring some sort of direct military confrontation with Japan, nothing's going to change in the foreseeable future, at least not within the current relations. But of course, this brings up the fundamental issue of all of this, which is China is trying to argue that it has historical claims over the Okinawa Islands. Japan has these formal claims that it set up in the Meiji era back in the 1870s. But it's completely excluded from this is the fact that, of course, there is an ethnic indigenous population in Okinawa who are the ones who are completely forgotten in all of this and are being used as pawns, as they have had to suffer through basically imperial regime after imperial regime, and now it's basically a site for U.S. military bases. And the Okinawan people are the ones who are used as political pawns in this game.
It's also worth noting that Japan has territorial disputes with almost every neighboring nation. I mean, are they not overstretching themselves here?
Well, obviously, this is remnants of the old Japanese imperial days, and I think that they certainly did try to extend themselves as much as possible, and I think now they have to bear the bitter fruits of that sowing of the seed that they did back in their imperial days. And I think it's just another testament to the fact that Japan really has a lot of ill will against it from a lot of the countries around in the Asia-Pacific region because of its imperialistic past.
The other topic that's being talked about is Japan rethinking its pacifist military policy. Are we getting closer to that, do you think?
We certainly are. We've seen this building up for years now, and a concerted political attempt to reassert Japanese nationalism and some sort of patriotism, where that has been really denigrated in the post-war era. But we've seen a concerted attempt to try to bring that back. Everything from trying to make teachers salute the Japanese flag during school ceremonies and things like this that have hitherto been really looked down upon. So we've seen a complete societal shift taking place over the last several years, and now with Abe in power, we have once again the specter of the change to the constitution to make it possible for Japan to actually deploy a military. So we'll see how this develops. It will probably still take quite a while to achieve that fundamental shift in Japanese public consciousness, but it really does seem to be taking place.
Mr. Corbett, let's go back to China. Washington released a report alleging the Chinese are gearing up for short but high-intensity territorial conflicts. Is Beijing posturing, or are they preparing? Do we know? Should we be worried?
Well, I think it has to be a mixture of all of those. I think that some of this is posture and bravado. For example, the release of this claim to Okinawa, I think, has to be seen in that regard. But there's no doubt that they are gearing up technologically, militarily, with some of their aircraft carrier buster weapons and other things that they're now deploying in the region quite openly. And their own aircraft carrier, for example. I mean, there's some big technological developments that the Chinese Navy and armed forces are making right now. And it's still quite a ways away from being able to, I think, assert itself with anything like what the U.S., for example, could assert in the region. But it is building up right now, and I think that analysts have to take that at least somewhat seriously, given the incredible amount of expense that China is pumping into its armed forces right now.
How do we see this Okinawa dispute unfolding?
Again, I have to see this as basically just a pawn in this chess game. I don't think it's going to be a central piece of this chess game. And again, this is only coming from some academics who've written a paper. It's not coming from the government, the Beijing government itself. I think there's a sort of arm's length nature to this. But once again, I think it's important that this does bring to the front and center the fact that this is, again, this type of imperialistic conquest that's going on between imperialist powers, whether that's Japan or China or the US or any of the proxies in the region. And in some ways, it's like saying perhaps we should return South America to the Spanish or something like that. I mean, again, it's a completely ridiculous idea based on the idea that there aren't indigenous populations with their own culture. And I think that's the excluded middle that has to be really taken into account in this. And hopefully it might actually help to serve to change people's opinions of the U.S. military bases that are there in Okinawa and that are deeply unpopular with the local population.
James Corbett, editor of the Japan-based Corbett Report news website. Thank you always for your time and analysis.